So, this can be as interactive as you want it to be. There's a chat window where you can type to me, or you can type to everyone. There is a, can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me, Miranda?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, we can.
Great. Hey, thanks. That's what I was trying to get at. If anybody wants to pipe in there every now and then, I'll be asking some questions and looking for a little bit of feedback. This can be interactive, or I can just sit here and drone on and on and on and on. But I figure we all have enough of that in either in classes or in meetings and whatnot. Thanks, Jasmine. I appreciate that. So my name is Joshua Ness. I am a UNT alum. I was an Honors College alum. I was in PLP in the College of Business. I graduated with a Bachelor's of Business Administration. I lived in Bruce Hall, lived in Mozart Hall, lived in the Sigma Phi Epsilon House. If you guys are on campus and you go to like Fry Street, the corner of Fry and what is it, Hickory right there? There's a white house with a wraparound porch just down Fry Street as you go towards Oak. I lived in that house. And had a really great time at UNT, and learned a lot, met a lot of really great people, and have continued to keep in touch with folks from places like the Honors College and PLP and the College of Business. So if any of you have been in trouble with school lately and have had to go see Mo McGinnis she was the dean. Is she still one of the deans? Anyway, tell her I said hi. I had quite a few meetings with her back in the day. It's neither here nor there. It's not important. But I lived abroad in Germany after graduating, and then after coming back to the States, I moved to New York in 2012, and have been here since then. I got involved in the startup community here in New York, and ultimately had my own company, had my own startup. And once we did that for several years, we wound the company down. And then I joined an innovation team at Verizon, which was then pivoted to become the 5G Labs group. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and about how 5G and other types of emerging and supporting technologies might just be able to save us in the next quarantine. Probably not in the way that you're thinking. So like I said, feel free to use the chat function in there if you don't necessarily want to interrupt while I'm talking. I do talk pretty quickly. I'm pretty sure Miranda is recording this and can make the recording available, and then I will make these slides available as well. That's a lot about me. If anybody has questions about New York or moving to New York or things like that, or something you've ever thought about doing, please do feel free to holler at me. That's my my Twitter right there on the slide, but my email address will be on the last slide. I do have some time after this presentation is done, so we can feel free to stick around a little bit longer and chat if you want to. Anyway. And also, before anybody decides that they really have this burning question as to whether or not 5G causes viruses, the answer is no. That would imply that radio waves can cause biological abnormalities and viruses inside your body, and that's silly. It's not true. So please don't believe that. If you know any people who sit around on Facebook all day and are really questioning as to whether or not this whole thing is true, as to whether or not 5G causes coronavirus, the answer is no. That's silly. Yeah. So moving on. 5G is a new type of connectivity layer, connectivity platform. If you open up your phone right now, chances are it says something like 4G, right, on the very top. The G stand for generations, right? And we've had a few generations up before this one, 4 to be precise. And 5G is actually different and revolutionary in ways that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But in order to figure out how it is that 5G and other types of supporting technologies can save us in the next quarantine, it's important to talk about and to understand how we got to where we are right now. And everyone's lived through it. Everyone lived through the 1Gs all the way to where we are now with 5G. But it takes a little bit of context to really have an understanding about why this is going to be groundbreaking, right? And why it is going to offer up solutions to problems either that are new because of emerging technology, or solutions to age-old issues, things like how the heck do you manage yourself during a quarantine? So the G's, like I said, stands for generations. It's mostly a marketing term, but they do have specifications and surrounding them. Right? There's a regulating agency in Europe called 3GPP, and they are responsible for. They're the governing body, the global governing body, responsible for setting the standards for what each successive generation of connectivity technology can do, and how it should do it, right? And so the carriers, globally, the carriers, they explore technology on their own, as well as working with technology providers like Ericsson and Samsung and Nokia and groups like that. There's several others that are very popular in China. In looking at this whole holistic landscape, this agency 3GPP sets these standards, right? And so for 1G, you had this brick phone. I call it the Zach Morris phone. If anyone on the line knows why it's called the Zach Morris phone, go ahead and throw it up in the chat, and you can get a special shout out from me. But it's the Zach Morris phone, the 1G phone. You could do one thing with it and one thing only, and that was make phone calls. That was it. Right, it was analog. Miranda, no, getting there, Roy. Getting there, Miranda. So it was used for just making phone calls, and that was all you could do. It was analog voice. It used circuits, the same circuits that you used in regular dialing, basically just copper wires. 2G was your flip phone. That was your Motorola Razr, right? Oh, Roy doesn't know, man. So Saved by the Bell. Zach Morris was the main character of a show back in the late 80s and early 90s called Saved by the Bell. And he had this brick phone, and it was the envy of literally every middle school and high school student who watched the show, because nobody could afford a cell phone. But they lived in California, and his dad was a hotshot lawyer or something. And so he had this brick phone that looked like that. And for most people my age and down, this was the first exposure anyone had to a cell phone, right? It was this brick phone on this show called Saved by the Bell, where this teenage dreamboat named Zach Morris tried to woo Kelly Kapowski and make his way through Bayside High. Anyway, moving on. If you haven't ever seen the original Saved by the Bell, definitely look it up. 2G was these flip phones, and all of a sudden you could do some things that you couldn't do with that brick phone. Namely, you could carry it around with you, but you could also you could start text messaging, right? And that came about in the early 2000s, and there was no, like, the phones those days they didn't say like 2G or 1G or anything like that. Like, nobody knew. Nobody called them that, right? All we knew is that phones were getting smaller, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you could start sending text messages back and forth. And originally, it was just between carriers. If you were a Sprint customer, you could only send text to Sprint customers. But then, out of nowhere, they just kind of opened it up. Like, there was no announcement. There were no commercials talking about it like there are right now. If any of you have watched any football this past season, you saw that pretty much every game was one big, giant, long Verizon commercial about 5G, and with a little bit of football thrown in between there. Sorry about that. And but nobody did that back then, right? And so all of a sudden, your phone could do things, and you would go in and get a new phone, and people were like, I guess I got a phone that can text now. I kind of know what that means, but okay. And then, of course, emoticons were born, and the rest is history. And so then with 3G, you started to have the beginnings of data, right? The beginnings of data. And what we mean by that is one of two things. One is the syncing of calendars and email, right? Because up to that point, you had things like Palm, and you had a few others that leading up into BlackBerry, where you could have this smartphone capability of like inputting things into your device, but then you had to like dock your device next to the computer and sync that data, right? There was no wireless one-to-one transfer. And all of Palms were like that, even up to and including after when BlackBerry launched. And the reason BlackBerry was so successful is because it used those 3G data capabilities in order to be able to do an over-the-air sync of email and calendar, right? And the other thing you could do with 3G is basically you could take pictures and send them to people, right? You could take a selfie and like send it to your boo, and that was pretty much it. And the picture wasn't even that good, right? And not many people had BlackBerries because they were only available for corporate clients for the first several years of the company's existence, right? They went into the IT departments of companies and they said, we want to give you and your employees access to these devices, which will allow them to work more efficiently from the field, right, from the road. So a lot of salespeople use them. A lot of people in government use them. If you have not ever done the NTDC program, where if it's still Dr. With, she will just straight up send you to Washington, D.C. and pay all of the bills and everything like that for you to be an intern on Capitol Hill. It's a great experience. I did it. It was wonderful. But I was there in, gosh, it was 2006, summer of 2006, and everybody on Capitol Hill had these BlackBerries, right? These big clunky things with the thumb roller on the side. And it was the thing to do in an elevator. That you whip out a phone and you start looking at your emails in an elevator, because there was really no internet back then. Like, you couldn't get on the internet from your device. The data capabilities were still too small with 3G, and that was the carriers, right? Because there was just so little room for data that it was emails and calendar. That's pretty much it, right? And so then we have 4G, and with 4G brought this explosion of capabilities, right? And I'll set that into context for you. When the iPhone was released in 2007, right, it looked a lot like this. It didn't look too much different than this. It was a little thicker, it was a little clunkier, but the form factor was basically the same, right? And in 2007, Steve Jobs stood up on stage in September in Cupertino, California, and he said one more thing. He said, it's an iPod that you can make phone calls with. And everyone went, oh, what? And they lost their minds, right? Because nobody had ever seen anything like that before. It had this user interface, this virtual user interface with a phone dialer that went away if you just pushed a button or backed out of it, right? And that was revolutionary. We hadn't ever really seen that before. The best you had was like a stylus and something like a palm, and you had to like tap and tap and tap and tap and hope that it actually took. But mostly you just stood there looking like an idiot tapping your phone with a stick, right? And so it was this revolution of user interface technology, but it also did a couple of things that a lot of people didn't write about that day. One is that it could download large files from the internet. And the second thing it could do was it had a full web browser capability. And we just talked about how the phones leading up to that, including the BlackBerries, did not have a full web browser. If anything, they stripped all the fun out of the internet so that they could show you bare bones pages of text, and that's pretty much it, right? No GIFs, no pictures, no videos, nothing like that. There's certainly no interactivity between applications and between users. And the reason was because the carrier said that it would crash their network. The carrier said that if everyone who has a smart device was all of a sudden given the ability to have a full web browsing capability on their 3G network at the time, right? Because 4G didn't come out until 2010, and so this was 2007. So we still had 3 years of having a smartphone and still being on 3G, right? And then Samsung quickly followed suit with their Galaxy series. And so to give you an idea, if any of you had a smartphone in 2010 and getting into 2011, when the 4G networks were first being rolled out, do you remember what the most innovative application you had on your phone was? It was the app that could do anything. Not anything, but like it could do more than pretty much anything else, right? Because up to that point, Apple opened up its developer platform, right? It opened up the developer store, it opened up its SDK, which is its software developer kit. And they said, if you want to make applications, if you want to make apps for an iPhone, go for it. And if you think you can get people to pay for those applications, even better. And so what did we get? We got a bunch of applications that made noises, essentially, right? We got an application called, remember Yo? Do you remember the application called Yo? It was a button. A big button on your phone, actually not too much smaller than that clock on my phone right there. It was a button, and if somebody else somebody else had the Yo app on their phone, if you pushed the button, the other person's phone went Yo. It was literally it. That was the app, and it got funded, right? They got funded millions of dollars to continue developing the Yo app. No idea what that actually means, but they did. I wonder whatever happened to them. If anyone's bored, look up what happened in the Yo app, and then submit that to one of your classes for extra credit and see what happens. You're not going to get it, but like it'll be fun. And as we started down the road into 2010 on the 3G network, at the height of the 3G network, we had flashlights app, Carl, right? The most innovative app that we had was Words with Friends. Did you guys ever play that? Some people still do. Words with Friends. The ability to play Scrabble online with somebody who lives in Tennessee or somebody who lives in Turkey, right? That was it. And leading up to that point, yeah, we had Angry Birds, but you can play Angry Birds in airplane mode. It doesn't use internet connectivity. It's not actually that advanced of a game. If anyone's interested in actually doing any sort of development, there was a game called Floppy Bird, where basically it was a bird that moved up and down and navigated through trees and things like that. It's built in Unity. It's actually very easy to do. I know some people who are running an intro to Unity class. It's like $20, I think. If anybody wants to learn how to make their own Floppy Bird or start programming in Unity, let me know, and I can point you in the right direction. It's a company here in New York City, and it's all online. It's happening next week. And so these were the types of apps that people had on their phone, and that was pretty much it. And people thought that was great that we had this connectivity where I could play this game with potentially a dozen people from all over the world. And like, that was the bee's knees. And then in 2010, at the end of 2010, 4G was released, right? And it brought with it streaming video, is what they call the killer app, right? Streaming video. We're going to be able to stream video to each other. And that's fantastic. And everyone was like, yeah, I don't care. Just give me more Words with Friends and Angry Birds. And except for a few people like Steve Jobs and people like Jeff Bezos and people like Reed Hastings and people like Mark Zuckerberg. And they said, wait a second, do you mean that I can have persistent app connectivity to all my customers and I can stream them video at the same time? Cool. And so they built their businesses and they built their empires and they built entire economies, right? The gig economy is something that's built on the back of 4G. It's something that's built on the back of persistent connectivity on the order of an average of about 30 to 40 megabits a second, right? Which means that you can do document sharing, you can do video recording and sending, you can do things like what appears to be consumer grade AR, and we're going to get into that in a second. You can do all of these things. You can have persistent location tracking, which means you can have things like ride hailing. You can do things like seamless e-commerce because you can with reliable certainty ensure that those packets are going to go back and forth that are containing all of your credit card information, nice and encrypted, and everything's great, right? But in a 3G world, that wasn't really possible. And so you've had this explosion in technological advancement and the things that we're able to do with this combination of an advancement in hardware, the iPhone, combined with the advancement in connectivity with 4G, right? If you have one without the other, not much happens, right? And so you had the iPhone, and yeah, it was great, and everyone loved it. Everyone except the guys at BlackBerry, who, when they took it apart, they found out that it had like a Mac processor inside, right? It had this huge processor, which meant that it had to have a huge battery. I don't know if you remember when these phones first came out and they looked like this, everyone was like, why would I want that? It's too big, and it doesn't look like it would feel very comfortable against my ear at all. Spoiler, we don't even use these to make phone calls anymore. And so what they found was that, yeah, the battery was so big, the processor itself was so robust because it had to process this full internet and browser experience as well as process all these large files that it was able to download. And the guys at BlackBerry, they thought, this is never going to catch on. The thing lasts like 8 hours on standby, right? The charge is absolutely rubbish. If you drop it, it breaks. It kept on like, it taxed that 3G network so much in those early years that the network would crash constantly, right? So it was not a good user experience. And so the folks at BlackBerry were like, we're good. Turns out they weren't. Does anybody know what BlackBerry does now? They do cybersecurity. They do web security. Speaking at Black Hat earlier last year in Las Vegas. BlackBerry has this big giant presence there on the show floor. Yeah. BlackBerry is completely out of the phone and mostly out of the connectivity business, and they do cybersecurity because they didn't read the writing on the wall. They didn't see that, yeah, this platform represented an advancement. All it needed was the connectivity to rise up and meet it, and then there was going to be an explosion of utility, right, of capabilities. So we have now we have all of these things and all of this amazing stuff that 4G allows us to do, and now all of a sudden enter 5G, right? And 5G carries with it these things that people talk about, right? We talk about things like much faster data rates and much higher data volume, right? We talk about things like low latency, okay? And latency is the time it takes a client device, and that's what this is, a client device, the time it takes the end user device to ping the network and then get a response back. Essentially, it's the time it takes a pitcher to throw a ball to the catcher and then to receive the ball back, right? That's latency. And that's how data works. It goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And with 5G, that latency is drastically reduced, right? Down to about between lower than like 5 milliseconds. And just for reference, it takes you about 350 milliseconds just to blink your eye, okay? And that's how quickly this data can transfer back and forth. Now, by itself, it sounds like it's just faster internet, right? Well, let me tell you, I'm paid by my company to say, no, of course it's not faster internet. It's not just faster internet. Look at all this stuff it can do. Like I just got done talking about all this cool stuff that 4G can do. You think it's just faster internet? No, this is amazing. In reality, it's kind of faster internet. It can do all these things, which ultimately amounts to faster internet, quicker internet, snappier internet. It does a few interesting things, like allows for a lot more people to be connected to those radios, connected to those towers and those nodes, so that I don't know the last time you guys have ever been to a concert or something, and you've tried to, like a big concert or something like a football game, even sometimes baseball games, and you tried to do any sort of running sort of applications that use data, that are moving data or files back and forth, like pictures and things like that. If you're trying to post to an Instagram story, sometimes it can be pretty tough. That's not because the network itself is congested, but because there's actually too many people trying to connect into that radio, and it's congesting that point of contact, that point of entry, right? 5G fixes that. And it is a fundamental change in the way that data is handled, both in the transport layer, which is the core, as well as in the radio waves, right? And we can talk about the radio waves here in a second. And so 5G carries with it these capabilities, which brings with it these currencies, right? These currencies that we talk about, where we're saying higher throughput, we're saying lower latency, we're saying more users, we're saying reliability, we're saying software-defined networking and things like that, right? And so a slide like this gives us really great ideas about what some of those changes and those deltas are going to be, and also gives you a couple of ideas about what that's going to bring with it, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily tell you how. For instance, over there in the top right, you have gaming under latency. Well, how is that going to impact gaming, right? Or things like autonomous vehicles under reliability, or things like connected wearables under connected devices. What does that actually mean, right? And so this slide is good, and it's got a lot of color to it, and it starts to get your mind moving. I actually prefer this one because on the right there, that wheel is very similar to what we just saw, but it starts to actually assign some numbers to these things, which is my preference, and so it starts to give, especially people who are thinking about how to develop using 5G, starts to give them some stuff to wrap their head around. Now, the stuff that you have on the left gets into what I was talking about earlier, and what are the actual fundamental and foundational changes of 5G. Number one is it's all fiber, right? Whereas 1G, 2G, 3G, they were mostly copper and coaxial cable. 4G was a mix of the two, and then 5G is an all fiber core. That basically means we're moving information as close as we can to the speed of light, and it's a it's a great way to move data around. Now the spectrum that's used, you hear a lot of, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this. And if anybody wants to really get into the intricacies of radio frequency engineering after this, then we can. But essentially, 5G at its very best uses very high frequency spectrum. Now, these phones on 4G, they're moving at about 700 megahertz, right? Which means that the curve of that radio wave is long and beautiful. It goes really, really far. It penetrates through a lot of objects, and it does pretty much everything we need it to do. On 5G, they have changed that from 700 megahertz to 28 or so gigahertz, right? And so instead of being long and flowing and beautiful, now all of a sudden that radio wave is scrunched. So it's like there's only a few millimeters of space, physical space, between the period, right, between the tops and the bottoms of that radio wave. Carl's asking if it would assist roll access. Not necessarily, because what we're talking about with that long, far-reaching 700 megahertz is what we have right now, right? My mom lives out in Ponder, just off 35 West, and even she has trouble getting 4G signals out there that are very reliable. With 5G, that wave doesn't travel as far, because that 28 gigahertz wave is so compressed and so excited that as you shoot it out, it begins to degrade over distances, right? And it has trouble passing through other objects. And so there are some deliverability issues that come with 5G that we've had to address. And one of those ways that we address them is what we call densification. It's putting up more towers. It's putting up more of those radios. And so exactly, more towers need to be erected, or it doesn't necessarily need to be a full-on tower. A cellular radio itself is actually as big as a 5G radio is actually as big as, say, 2 laptops that are just like put end to end, right? If you take 2 laptops and put them together like this, that's about how big a 5G radio is. And so you're not going to need big giant towers all over the place. You're not going to be like a huge eyesore all around Denton, but you are going to need more of them on places like rooftops, utility poles, things like that, right? And so, and then on the back end, we're using more regular common hardware that is using software to run those switching points and to run that transport layer. And then the bottom thing there is called multi-access edge compute. Now, that's something actually really unique we're going to talk about here in just a second, because that's not actually a function of 5G. It's something that's enabled by 5G, right? And with 5G, we know that we're going to get up to, what did we say that 4G was? About 30 to 40 megabits per second, right? And that's what you're going to get on average, right? If you're in densely populated urban areas, places like New York City, where I am, places like downtown Dallas, you're going to see upwards of like 100 megabits, 110, maybe even 120, right? Theoretically, 10 years ago, when 4G was released, the theoretical limit, the upper bound, was about 100 megabits a second, right? And we've been able to surpass that with 4G, largely due to things like fiber optic cabling in the core. Now, with 5G, we're going to see speeds up to and potentially exceeding 10 gigabits a second, right? This is a massive jump. And so you're going to start seeing the evolution of new technologies. And that's what we're here to talk about today. This 30 minutes was basically just getting to know each other and laying the groundwork and laying the foundation for what are we actually talking about, right? And so what the thinking is, and this isn't a Verizon statement or even a Josh statement. The thinking, this actually comes from the World Economic Forum out of Davos, is where they coined this phrase, the fourth industrial revolution, the cyber physical era of mass connectivity of many things around us, and the ability for those things to all communicate with each other and ultimately communicate with us and help us make better decisions, right? And so we know that that 5G is here in a lot of places in a lot of cities, and the way that it usually is described is something that I actually take issue with, and I wish publications and even some of the carriers are guilty of this. I wish they wouldn't describe it this way. What they like to say is that we just got turned on. We just had 5G turned on in a place like Dallas, and we were achieving speeds almost up to 2 gigabits a second. And do you know what we were able to do with all that speed? We were able to download a movie in 6 seconds. Oh, what? That's amazing. I know, right? A movie in 6 seconds. Pop quiz, everybody on the line. When's the last time you downloaded a movie to your phone? Exactly, right? It's not something anyone does. And anytime anyone, I'm giving a talk like this at a conference or something, and so there's always somebody in the back of the room who's like, I download movies to my phone. I'm like, when do you have to download movies to your phone? And they're always like, oh, I'm about to get on a plane. Exactly. When you're about to have no expectation of connectivity whatsoever, that's when you download a movie to your phone. Congratulations, right? Because we stream, because we have created these technologies that allow us to stream everything we need. We stream and it's not on our device, it's out in the cloud. Right? And everybody knows what the cloud is. It's servers that are located somewhere, not where you are, probably in California or somewhere like in the Carolinas. And that's where all the data is located, right? Because that's where you're getting your Netflix pulled from. That's where you're getting your Instagram photos pulled from. None of that's on your device. Your phone is asking for that information from way, way, way far away. And it's getting that information in a relatively short period of time, a couple of seconds, right? When you launch Instagram, how long is it before you see those photos? 2 seconds. When you launch Netflix, how long before it actually buffers out and finally gives you your what was it, 780? Your picture, right? Maybe 3-4 seconds. We're okay with that, right? We've come to be a streaming society that is okay with the little bits of lag that are there as this data in all its various forms is delivered to us, right? And so that's something that it's a society that we've designed, right? And so with where was I going with this? So the ability to download a movie in 6 seconds, that's fantastic. Like it's using a metric that no one ever uses for a reason, for a very specific reason, right? Because why I'm convinced that publications use this as a metric, because everyone remembers Napster. Everyone remembers LimeWire. Everyone remembers how maddening it was to try to download a song or an album or, God forbid, a movie and sit there and wait and have it go tick, 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 tick as you're waiting for this thing to download. And what happens when it finally downloads? It's a horrible quality. It's in a different language, right? With subtitles in a completely different language. And you're like, who's actually watching this? And then you had to you pulled all your hair out because now you had to go and do it again, right? And it took sometimes the better part of a day. And so everyone remembers what that frustration is like, right? Everyone remembers and everyone knows frustration of having to download a playlist when you're sitting on the plane about to taxi out onto the runway, and all of you're trying to download the podcast and you're trying to download the Spotify songs that you forgot to download in the first place, and you're just waiting for this thing to load. Everyone remembers what that's like. And so when we say you can download the Avengers in all of 6 seconds, everyone's like, wow, no kidding, that sounds amazing, right? And so, but it doesn't actually tell you what you can do with this technology, because what did we say 15, 20 minutes ago? We said that when hardware advancements meet connectivity advancements, that's when things begin to change. But what do we have right now? We have this shifted paradigm. We have this connectivity advancement that honestly is a little overkill for devices like this. And yeah, there are 5G devices that are out there, and these 5G devices will continue to hey, John, will continue to do more things and be able to offer up new experiences. But as of right now, you're not seeing a whole lot of them. Right now, what do we have here on this slide? We're talking about, on the left side, there's a lot of what we call B2C, right? Business to consumer use cases. Things like cloud gaming, Stadia, Google's new cloud game streaming platform is a really good example of this, right? You're still not going to be able to get Steam quality or AAA quality games on a device, mostly because those files would just be too big, and the games themselves are too complex to stream in real time, right? If anyone's tried to download a really, really big game to your phone prompts you to go into Wi-Fi because it's going to be a really, really big file, which you can then go into airplane mode and play that game without having to have any sort of internet connectivity, right? And that's because the capabilities of 4G don't allow for real-time cloud gaming or even any sort of game streaming. The next gen user content, right? When I talked earlier about consumer grade AR, 5G will allow for streaming AR. And you might think to yourself, well, don't I already have streaming AR? The answer is kinda. We have AR in applications like Instagram or Snapchat, or I think Wayfair has an AR feature where you can see what a couch is going to look like in your apartment or something. I think there are sneaker companies that will show you. You can take your phone and you can like point it at your feet, and it'll show you what the sneakers are going to look like on your feet with a particular outfit, right? And so a lot of people think that, yeah, that's streaming over the air and I'm getting it on demand in real time exactly when I want it. And the answer is no, you're actually not. All of that is downloaded in the background after you download the application, and then when you open it, it downloads new packets in the background so that when you do launch that application, it's already hosted there on the device. It's already on your device itself, right? And so, and then on the right-hand side, you have what we call B2B use cases, right? These business-to-business use cases. These industries that are going to be able to take advantage of 5G in a very, very big way. If 4G was huge and revolutionary for consumers, 5G is initially going to be revolutionary for businesses and enterprise companies, and then those use cases will make their way into the consumer hands, right? And so things like healthcare with hospitals, things like smart retail, and not just retail. You think about the entire retail supply chain, everything from how a product is produced and then delivered. You start thinking about inbound and outbound logistics and how they impact manufacturing and the transportation industry as a whole. Being able to keep track of inventory. There's a fun story that I have. One of the things that you see here is this massive sensorization on the bottom right. You see that phrase multi-access edge compute. Again, we'll talk about that in just a second. It gets into the cloud thing that we were talking about. It really gets us to the meat of the discussion. But you see this massive sensorization. That's basically called IoT, right? IoT stands for the Internet of Things. It means that there are going to be things around us that are all connected to the internet, and we start to see it now. Things like with the Nest thermostats, right? Smart speakers, light bulbs. I know people here, and I'm sure you know people too. You walk into your apartment and you say, "Alexa, I'm home," and all of a sudden lights come on, music comes on, the thermostat begins to change. Right, and this is all thanks to IoT, the Internet of Things. And so, as you start seeing more and more things being connected and being able to share that information, streaming in real time, then you're going to start seeing changes and advancements into how businesses are run, and ultimately into how consumer applications are delivered to you. I have two examples there. One is this idea of streaming data. One of the use cases for 5G is drones, right? Drones that can fly and that can send high quality data over the air in real time. And you ask yourself, like, can't we already do that? The answer is no, you can't. If any of you have been to like a nice summer wedding recently and there were drones out there taking photography, two things happened. One, there was a really annoying buzz going on above your head, which really distracted you from what was going on. But the two is that that thing was moving around, capturing footage, and then it had to come back and dock itself so that the users could pull out the memory stick and actually download that high quality video footage to the hard drive so that it can then be processed. Now, if you're talking about a drone taking pictures of a wedding, that's one thing. If you're talking about films being captured and rendered in 4K or 8K, you're talking about terabytes of data, right? A huge issue in the film industry is the time that it takes to transport data, sometimes physically transporting a hard drive from the site of filming all the way to the site of post-production, having to pull that information off the hard drive, upload it into a rendering application, and then you can finally start engaging in post-production. That is a huge problem. If anybody is here as an RTVF major, you know what I'm talking about. And so the fact that 5G allows this streaming of video sharing, right? The streaming of video from things like drones or things like potentially even cinematic film cameras, right? That means that people can take action in real time. They can start making better decisions in real time. If you're talking about drones overseeing like a disaster area, that real-time information can be super handy, right? And so, yeah, thanks, John, I appreciate that. And so this ability for these new types of devices to be able to stream information somewhere is huge, and it's radical. It's a radical change from what we have now. Now, when you start applying that into IoT, you start seeing that you can start having cameras that are maybe not these big cinema quality cameras, but they're actually just small cameras that are no bigger than some of the security cameras you might see around homes today that are produced by companies like Nest. Right, and so if these cameras are able to capture 4K video and then send that stream immediately into something like a cloud server or an edge server, which is essentially just a cloud server moved really, really close to where you are or where the client is, the client devices are, then you start having this real-time instant ability to run 4K video footage through something like a computer vision algorithm and some sort of AI algorithm, and be able to process information and be able to make choices. And this comes in handy for a whole wide variety of reasons. One of them is my favorite, right? We talked before about how 5G is built on fiber, right? Now, when you think about the carriers like Verizon and AT&T and everybody else, like we don't build anything, right? Phones, those are made by what? Apple, Samsung, OnePlus, right? Some really LG. My phone's an LG. So I'm pretty happy with it. We don't build the networking equipment, right? That's been evident with this whole Huawei situation out of China, where carriers don't want to use certain types of equipment because of a variety of reasons. But we decide to use companies like Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung to build networking equipment because the carriers don't build that. Even the fiber in the ground itself is not provided by the carriers, by the networks. It's usually provided by a company called Corning, right? And then the carriers apply their software-defined networking functions across all of these things that actually makes the internet work on mobile devices, right? So this company called Corning, they're located in a town called Corning here in New York, and they make fiber optic cable. That's one of the major things they do. And this fiber comes in these big giant spools, like about as tall as this room might be, right? Big giant wooden spools. And this fiber is coiled around these wooden spools, and then they get loaded onto trucks, and then ultimately they find themselves on the back of something like a Verizon truck with workers that are like funneling this stuff underground to help lay the foundations of this core network, right? And so these big giant spools of fiber, they're worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. A company like Corning, they have to write down tens of millions of dollars in losses in revenue because of the loss of inventory, because these big giant spools of fiber walk away. Now you might be asking yourself, like, what's anyone going to do with a big giant spool of fiber? And the answer is nothing. It's not anyone taking them. What happens is these spools of fiber get picked up by a forklift, and they get moved around, and they get set down, and the company doesn't know where they are because the driver put it in the wrong spot, or the person who was supposed to pick it up didn't, and now it's left over and it's just sitting there, but people have moved on to work on something else. And so in these massive, giant warehouses, all over both in the town of Corning and also in the other areas where they have production facilities, they just lose. And if they're not alone, all production companies have this issue of this inventory that just gets lost. They don't know where it went. It's not gone. They just don't know where it is. And here's an easy rule of business: if you don't have it, you can't sell it, right? And so if they don't know where it is, they can't apply any sort of revenue towards it, and so they have to write it down as a loss. And if there was a way, and there's a couple of different options here. There's things like RFID, and whether or not they can apply RFID across all of their entire lines of inventory is one thing. But another potential solution is to have cameras all over the factory floor and the warehouse floor that are able to recognize what these objects are and recognize where they're supposed to go and what's supposed to happen, and be able to read barcodes from very far away. And then if that was a deployable situation, they would be able to, in real time, know exactly where all of their inventory was and be able to have AI-type algorithms that are able to instruct their workforce on where to go, what to pick up, where to take it, things like that, right? And so when we talk about massive sensorization, we're talking about the ability for sensors to be placed in a wide variety of areas, whether it's B2B with those businesses and factories, or whether it's B2C in places like homes, and be able to share those vast amounts of data back and forth as quickly as possible, right? And that edge computing that you see there, that multi-access edge computing, like I said, it's basically taking the cloud and moving it as close to you as possible. So that way, when you are checking something like Instagram, it loads like that. Or when you're opening something like Netflix, it loads like that. Now, those are easy examples for us to wrap our heads around now. What about the cars that are traveling at 90 miles an hour next to each other, and one of them needs to change lanes? How much latency or lag are we willing to put up with then? The answer is not very much, right? And so, where'd my slide go? And so when we think about what 5G is going to do, it's going to create this disruption in all of these different types of economies because of these new technologies that it enables, right? We talked about intelligent video. We talked about AI there at the edge, right? And so when we think about 5G, it's not just faster internet that lets you download a movie in 6 seconds. It's actually going to disrupt a lot of the things that we do right now, both in our homes as well as in places like factories in towns like Corning, New York, right? And so the question then is, how is this supposed to help me get through the next pandemic? Wasn't that the title of this webinar in the first place, right? Well, yeah. So here's what I've been dealing with. I live alone, and so I've basically not seen or talked to anybody in person in like 4 weeks, right? It can get really frustrating. And one of the things that would be really interesting is if I could be more plugged in to society from here in my home, right? And of course, this has implications beyond just something like a quarantine, right? And so when we start thinking about how 5G is going to impact us over the course of the next 10 years, and that's how long these Gs usually last, right? About 10 years between generations of technology, we're going to start seeing new things like this, right? We talked about streaming AR content. We're going to start being able to have digital representations of physical things in our spaces, in our physical spaces, or our local spaces, right? And right now you can see these devices, they're using a device like this, right? And that's only because this is what we have right now. Like whenever we want to look at something through a particular lens, we hold our phone up, right? If any of you guys have ever been to like a sporting event or something, I was in Mexico City several months ago, and I was at a lucha libre fight. It was actually really interesting. And there were people there who spent the entire time holding their phone up and looking at it through their phone, right? Now, whether they were video recording it or whether they were trying to capture some moment, I don't know. But like, who are you going to show that to? Who's going to watch like 17 minutes of a lucha fight that they weren't at? Like, maybe. But yeah, exactly, just like Disneyland. It's super annoying, but this is all we have, right? And so this is how we measure new experiences. This is how we engage in those new experiences, even if it means that we have to run into a pole every now and then, right? Eventually, it's going to start looking like this. Now, this type of a headset, this is available now, right? Now, and you're going to be able to start having these what's called mixed reality or extended reality. This combination of virtual reality and augmented reality combining into one where you're able to create a world around you. And using advanced connectivity means that these things can be wireless, because right now a lot of them still have to be the data intensive ones, like an Oculus, still has to be connected into a computer to have high quality VR functions, right? And so that's what these headsets look like now, but eventually they're going to look just like glasses that you have on your head, and eventually they're going to be just like contacts. Now that's really far out, but the idea of them looking like just a pair of Warby Parkers, it's not too far out. Within the next 10 years, you're going to see a couple of things. One is that these types of augmented reality and mixed reality headwear is going to be in the form factor of a pair of glasses, right? And the second thing is that that's going to begin replacing the need for something like a mobile device. Because right about now, most of these devices, they have to connect into some sort of a hub, right? A hub like this that has what inside it? What happened when those BlackBerry guys ripped open that first iPhone? What did they find? They found a massive processor and a big old battery. That processor is what has kept this phone looking like this the entire time for 13 years. Because it has the processor, because it's the one who's able to actually process all this data, right? But what did we say edge computing does? Edge computing takes those supercomputer that usually live in the cloud, these virtual machines, and it brings them as close to you as humanly possible so that 5G can begin moving data back and forth at speeds that mirror and sometimes even improve upon on-prem processing. Right? Let me say that again. You might have data processing that occurs at the edge of the network, maybe just a couple of miles from where you are. And the act of moving data back and forth, having it processed there at the edge and bringing it back to your client device will sometimes be faster than if you were to process it on the device itself. That's insane. And what it means is you don't need this as a hub device anymore. Right? And so all the ways that we process information from this device, things like sight and sound and speech and haptics, now you can start deconstructing that and have that in the form of glasses, AirPods or earbuds, right? Maybe clothing that has haptics embedded into it, all of it being connected into a network that can give you any experience that you want. Right now, here we are in this pandemic, in this quarantine, and we're all trying to do Zoom meetings. I'm not unconvinced that Zoom didn't engineer the pandemic so that they could, so that their usage would just go sky high. It's not true. I don't believe that. Please don't repeat that. But if you were on a Zoom call right now, up until this past couple of weeks, I've never been on a Zoom call. Right? I was used. My company uses Hangouts, and so we have these meetings where we're all trying to be on these calls together, and it really is. They just came to Zoom. I don't know, maybe, or even VR like this. And so we have, I wish that I had this ability to be more connected to my friends. There's people who are even on this call right here that I've been on this webinar with, that I've been on video calls with. And yeah, it's kind of cool, but I wish I was able to be there and have more immersive experiences with them, because right now I can only take someone and we can only do whatever it is I have in my apartment. God bless an application like House Party where we can maybe play drawing games or something together, right? And so if we were to start thinking about what do virtual reality meetings look like, this is what a lot of us start thinking about, right? Which seems a little crazy. But what if it was actually more like this? right? What if it was actually a collaborative environment where you're able to all be in a new place together, and maybe it's a place that actually exists, where you're taking VR, very immersive VR footage of an actual office, something like this, and you're able to be there in avatar form and actually collaborate with your coworkers or with your friends, right? Maybe it's somewhere totally new, right? Maybe it's something that appears almost lifelike, even if it doesn't actually exist, or maybe it does. This is a company that we work with called Garu. They're from Paris. This is the Guggenheim Museum that you can go and be in virtually. You saw before there was a person who was looking at an apartment to see if she wanted to rent it, right? You're talking about being above the city, and this uses actual high definition footage and places you in it in this virtual environment. Their goal is to make a digital twin of the world so that you can do things like process transactions. You saw that was a Tesla there before. If you can be in there and actually sit inside a Tesla and see what it's like, all the way down to the grain of the leather, right? And the salesperson can be in there with you answering your questions, right? And there's even there would even be a way to take it for like a virtual test drive. Right, and so virtual reality meetings, they're going to be coming a long way from something like this to this, right? And so this would be a really interesting way, and it would be a way for a lot of us to not only keep sane and be more productive in an environment like a quarantine, but it will allow for more virtualization of job functions. And one thing I think we're going to find is that a lot of job functions that people thought had to be in person no matter what. Now we found out that we can do them from home, right? And that's given the tools that we have now. What happens when this becomes a reality in the next probably 12 to 18 months? Then you're going to start seeing the virtualization of a lot of other types of job functions. How many of you got kids, or you're hearing about people who have children who are in this quarantine who are about to like pull their hair out, right? But because I was listening to a story today. If you guys listen to NPR, there was a story today about a woman who is a professor, and she's trying to teach her own class, her college class, while trying to manage the learning goals of her small children. And the story was that the child was just curled up in a fetal position, crying on the couch because the way that the teacher was using Google or Zoom or whatever, and the child just could not get into it, right? There was no engagement there, and so the kid was just having a meltdown, right? What if there was a way to actually engage your children to start learning more immersively? What if there was a way to put them in outer space and tell them to go and literally create a star, right? And they could do it with other people, right? This is an organization that we work with out of Columbia University called Visceral Science. I actually was part of the group that helped fund and make this program. And this is for middle school kids who want to learn about astrophysics, right? Teachers who want to teach them about astrophysics. And so you can see they're creating celestial bodies and they're launching asteroids into orbit, right? And these are the types of ways that you can have this collaborative experience, multiple people inside these environments performing all sorts of different functions. And very soon, with the help of something like 5G, you're going to be able to do this wirelessly. They're not going to have to be tethered to some really powerful laptop, because most homes in America right now don't even have a laptop computer powerful enough to run a program like this. And so pretty soon, and when I say pretty soon, I mean within the next 1 or 2 years, this stuff is going to be able to be virtualized into the network, so that all you need is that client equipment that actually does this. General consumption, I think probably within the next 5 years. I think 5 years will be the tipping point to where you start seeing most people not carrying around a cell phone, and virtual reality mobile network operators. That's funny, Jared. Yeah, I think about 5 years is going to be that tipping point. I think probably starting in a year or so, you're going to start seeing early adopters not carry cell phones around anymore, because they have eyewear, they have earwear, and anything they need, they can just pop glasses on or pop something in their ear, get it, and go. So as this brings us to the end, we talked about IoT, and in my opinion, and it's a fairly educated opinion, 5G will enable this complete Internet of Things, to where information, all sorts of information is taken in and sensed and moved and stored and analyzed, and then ultimately shared with other electronic platforms and programs, or people who can make better decisions based on that information, right? And so it's in this way that I think new, both B2B as well as B2C immersive experiences will be able to take something like a quarantine, where, like I said, if you're like me, you live alone and you haven't been outside basically in 4 weeks, and make it a little more bearable, and make it not quite so, whatever this is. Anyway, that's it. That's all I got. Like I said, if anybody wants to continue chatting here today, I'm definitely available. If you want to send me an email, please do. Please feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Send me a little note when you add on LinkedIn. That way it's not just some person's name that I'm not sure who you are. Send me a note saying that you saw the Honors College presentation. If you have any questions about any of the stuff I mentioned at UNT, please reach out to me or Miranda. If you have any questions about moving to New York City and what it's like to live here, please give me a shout. I'd love to help you out. I'd love to talk about it. I run a small group here of UNT alumni in New York City. I also run a much larger group of Texans who live in New York. So if you did decide to come to New York, you sure wouldn't be alone. So yeah, that's it. Happy to, if you feel like you want to come off mute, if you have any questions or you want to type them here into the chat, I'm happy to answer any questions, just so long as they aren't about 5G causing viruses.